Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all here. I want to talk about the transformative world of fandom and fan fiction. And to do that, I'm going to tell a few stories, but I'm going to start with my own. So as you heard, I teach teachers, or I teach languages and teach language teachers. I work over at Malmö University, and I tend to focus on using technology for language teaching. But I'm also a fan. In fact, as you can see up here, I'm a member of the Sherlock fandom currently, and I like reading fan fiction, discussing fan theories. I'm part of a fan podcast. I'll make reference to them later. And one of my absolute favorite things to do is track down spoilers and go watch filming. So I'm really looking forward to the next filming that's going to start up again in April. But my first fandom was actually the Harry Potter fandom, which I joined about 11 years ago, when I was a doctoral student working on my doctoral thesis, which was a fascinating study on the use of different types of error correction for language learning. And it was great, but it was very stressful. So I was looking for an outlet, something to do that would kind of take my mind off the statistics and whether I could get enough participants. So I started rereading the Harry Potter books. Now this was in 2005, shortly before the release of the Half-Blood Prince. And so the Harry Potter fandom online was really active. And when I finished rereading the books, I was desperate for more. In fact, I was really not only desperate for more books, which were coming quite slowly, but I wanted to discuss my favorite character, this guy, because I thought, he kind of reminded me of some of the things I faced in my own teaching. But I found fan communities online. I found places where people were speculating, writing fan fiction, producing fan art, like this piece which I commissioned from someone who lives in Belgium. And this is sitting over my desk in my office right now, so it inspires me when I'm grading, Severus Snape in his grading. But I didn't really share with people too much that I was a fan at that time. I was a student. I wanted to be taken seriously. I was worried about my professional perception. But there were other reasons why I didn't talk so openly about being a fan. And one of them has to do with perceptions of fans. So here's one that's taken from a recent publication. Around the time Benedict Cumberbatch, we saw him in the first slide, playing Sherlock, was kind of on the nominated for his Oscar, which he didn't get, but good shot there. But we can see here from the title, Benedict and the Cumberbatches, the term that some of his female fan base have given themselves, that fangirls in particular are kind of seen as a bit hysterical, over the top, maybe something to be concerned about, but definitely something to maybe make fun of for the purpose of clickbait and selling newspapers. So it's not always a good thing to be a fangirl. Sometimes it's actually a bad thing. And perhaps one thing even worse than being a fangirl might be being a fanboy, because we do have some other more extreme examples. This is a photo, you can find it online, taken a few hours before John Lennon was shot and murdered here. And it's used, sometimes we have this concern, this comes from what's referred to as the slippery slope idea of fandom, that your involvement in fan practices will lead you into this kind of murderous rage, so that your consumption of media might lead you to going over the top. But that's not what my experience in fandom has been. In fact, I've seen fandom as a really wonderful communal, transformative space that's led to a lot of learning and inspiration. And this is something I want to share with you here, and then I'm going to bring us back to my story as well. So I'm going to share a couple of stories. And the first comes from a recording at a fan convention in Atlanta. Every year, for the past 3 years, there's been a convention called 221BCon for fans of all sorts of Sherlock Holmes iterations, not just the BBC Sherlock one. And at this session, the podcast I'm a part of invited fans to come and share their specific stories about how fandom had transformed their lives. And here's one of my favorites from a fan who found that her experiences in fandom really led to her career. She felt that if you master something in fandom, it can really translate to what you do for your job, as was the case for her. She started off as a member of old school Star Trek fandom. And one day, she made a fan vid, a mashup. And it somehow, through a long convoluted process, came to the attention of Paramount. and she now finds herself as an editor in television. And she says when she finds herself in New York City in these nice fancy editing booths, she often reflects on the skills that she uses every day in her job were those that she developed as a fan, making fan videos. So that's kind of a skill-based transformation in fandom. But we see other things that people encounter that also transform them, some of them deeply personal. Here's another experience also related by a 32-year-old who only came to terms with her sexuality as a result of participating in discussions in fandom. So I think we have a lot of fans in here, do we? Yeah? And we're familiar with fan fiction, right? There's a certain type of fan fiction called slash, which is often same-sex pairings that you usually don't find in the media that people are responding to. But for this particular fan, she participated in a lot of Tumblr discussions which were around slash communities, people who were really interested in usually male-male partnerships, but also explorations of other sexualities. And it was through that she came to terms with her own bisexuality, through reading fan fiction and being involved in fan discussions. And she had this to say about herself, that she understood that she had always liked women, but she just considered herself straight, until she joined in these discussions and thought, no, I'm really bisexual. And for her, she also engaged in the process of writing fan fiction about John Watson coming to terms with his bisexuality as a way for her to deal with her coming to terms with her own bisexuality. So for her, fandom was a deeply personal, developmental space, and fan fiction came into play there. Here's another personal story. This is one from an interview. I had a chance to sit down with a group of fans who were from Germany who'd gone to the UK to see Martin Freeman on stage when he was performing in Richard III. So he's John Watson in the Sherlock stories. And this particular woman shared with me her story about how fandom, the community in particular, helped her deal with a very difficult time in her life. She was in a very difficult marriage. Her husband had forbid her from going online. He thought that she was spending too much time in fandom spaces. And this had been when she was in the Torchwood fandom. After a while, she found the Sherlock fandom and had started reading fan fiction. And she found the stories very beautiful and moving. And so she reached out and communicated with the authors. And it was through these authors that she developed friendships and a support group to help her eventually leave her marriage. And she said that these communities and support groups and the fan fiction itself helped her to see that she's not wrong, or that there are other possibilities to living your life, that when you're stuck in a place, you don't have to accept that. You can move on. But I'm going to take us back a little bit more deeply to fan fiction, because we are talking about language today, and I want to make an obvious connection. So I had a chance to travel pretty far north to talk with some other people, and I encountered a fan who lived a bit north of Stockholm, and she lived in a rather remote community where she had found that she was a big fan of the Harry Potter books back in the day, but there weren't people in her community she could talk to, because as a mother, she was perceived as being too old to like the Harry Potter books. These were supposed to be children's books, so there was no one she could spend time with. So she, like me, had found online fan communities, and they were in English, but this is a way for her to communicate outside of her local context. But she felt very self-conscious about her English skills. So she read fan fiction, she read some of the discussions, but she was primarily a lurker for several years. After a while, though, she began to develop confidence and started leaving comments. So in English, this was her first venture into participating openly in fandom. She started commenting, and then began to know the people she was commenting with, who encouraged her to start writing, because she really wanted to write as well. So she began writing fan fiction in English with the help of other English-speaking fans around the world giving her feedback. And as of last year, she's now been involved in online communities for writers of original fiction in English. So she's transformed from a lurker to an actual writer of original fiction. Not that she's published yet, but she's moving in that direction. So for her, the fandom communities provided an access to develop her language skills and kind of live out a dream that she couldn't realize on her own. I have another story from another writer. This is someone I know from the podcast I'm involved in. Her name is Lisa Nichols. That's what she publishes under. But what she has to say is that without fandom, she wouldn't have started writing again. 10 years ago, she'd given up her dream to write science fiction. and she had to stop to take care of her mother. But she'd faced a lot of discouragement when she tried to publish. Agents weren't interested in her. She just wasn't making headway, and she'd lost confidence in herself. At some point, she too had discovered fandom and was really inspired and began writing fan fiction. And she had a story that was pretty popular. And one day she got a comment on a story from someone who said, "Hey, I really like what you've written. I'm an agent. If you have something original, get in touch." It was an agent from one of the publishing places she had tried to contact with during her science fiction days. This woman is now her agent, and she's publishing kind of action romance novels. She had her two first books were published last year. This is the first of them, the cover up there. So for her, she's now realized the dream of becoming a published writer. So these are the dreams of other people and how fandom and fan fiction has transformed them. But I also want to now bring it a little closer to home. Remember how I said I wasn't really open with being a fan? And now that I'm a bit more established and I see the transformative nature of fandom for other people, I've kind of been able to become more open here, especially as I've moved to Sweden. And I've found very fan-friendly colleagues in the English teacher education program. These are they up there. Here at Malmö University. So this was taken in 2014 in the fall. The man in the snitch, Björn Sundmark, had just given his professor lecture on the different pedagogical styles of the Hogwarts faculty. So the rest of us showed up in support and wore our robes. But this was a community where people were kind of open to trying new things with teaching, and I was willing to see if I could maybe try something that I'd seen online. So we were looking at, in particular, ways to re-energize some of our teacher education. And there's a really fascinating class that Björn always is involved with for our first-year students who have to take a course on teaching literature at the secondary level. And there are a variety of books taught in there, but it's an opportunity for our students to learn about literature for the purpose of teaching students in years 7 to 9 and then upper secondary. And one of the books that we use regularly in there is The Hobbit. And as it turns out, Björn is a big fan of The Hobbit. But this was also an opportunity to bridge something that's been a problem, and that is the teaching of literature and language together. And I'd seen some really fascinating things going on in the Harry Potter fandom, something called blog-based collaborative role play, where you have a blog and each person writes portions of a story from the perspective of their character. And I thought, well, why don't we try something like this, that you can analyze literature through telling stories about it. So fan fiction, a kind of transformative storytelling, is also a kind of literary analysis. It's also a great way to practice your reading and writing skills. So we developed something called the Blogging Hobbit, which was a project where students were organized into groups so they could learn through doing a type of activity they could probably use when teaching their own pupils in future. So they were assigned to tell a missing moment. So pick something from The Hobbit where the author, Tolkien, kind of disappears, fades to black. And each of them needed to pick a character from the story and write from that perspective. So they formed groups of like 3 to 6. And groups of 3 had 3 characters, groups of 6 had 6 characters, and they did that kind of role-play storytelling where they bounced back and forth between the characters. And they produced some really fun stories. We did this for 2 years. And the results of it were, there were 31 completed stories. They ranged in length from 2,000 words to the one we have back here, which was a monster story of 16,000 words, written by a group which named themselves the Dream Team, because this assignment was a dream for them. They were a group of fans and non-fans, one of whom claims to have been a fan since the beginning of time. So they really took to this, even though they weren't fans necessarily of the text they were reading. But based on feedback we've gotten from students and looking at their own writing, we observed a couple of things. There was some great vocabulary development, especially in the area of adjectives and adverbs, which is good for teachers. You want your English teachers to have a good vocabulary. A lot of students also identified feeling more comfortable with writing, so greater writing fluency. The negative side was that the stories didn't quite look like actual fan fiction, and some which were published in online fan fiction archives, like the one here, didn't elicit a lot of response from actual fans. So we went back and tried to change the stories a little bit, and we've moved into our next project. This is one that is just wrapping up. where we got feedback to make the stories more fan-inspired. So it's called A Study in Sherlock, and now the students are writing case fic, so mysteries, based on some sort of Sherlock Holmes story, or creating an original Sherlock Holmes mystery. But they have to put a twist on it. Much like with BBC Sherlock, setting Sherlock Holmes in the 21st century, they have to twist it by moving the universe or combining things. So they're allowed to have a little bit more fun with it. And even the students in the class who are not fans of Sherlock are fans of something. And the stories that are coming out are really imaginative. One of my favorites is a crossover, so they're mixing Sherlock Holmes and Scooby-Doo. So what we see now is, how do you write Sherlock and John Watson hanging out with the Scooby Gang in the 1960s? How do you adjust the language so it fits in their storytelling? But even more interestingly, and maybe a little less wacky, is another one of my favorite stories. And here we have a quote up here of one that is actually based on an actual murder that took place in Stockholm in the 1930s. And this time, they moved John and Sherlock into Stockholm. They changed their address from 221B Baker Street to Bragevägen 21B, an actual street there. And they switched up some of the names of the characters. So we have a Gregson with 2 S's instead of 1 to sweetify it a bit. But so they've tried to kind of merge what they know with what they're learning and telling these imaginative, really creative mysteries. And I'm looking forward to seeing how the Sherlock fandom reacts to some of these. But this brings me back to my own transformation. I started off by saying I kept my fanish experience and fandom separate so I could be taken seriously. But what I'm also finding is that bringing fandom into my practice as a teacher trainer and a language researcher has reinvigorated my own research. And it's led to a lot of pleasure and hopefully new opportunities and new ideas for my own students. And that's it. Thank you.